Howdy, all of you delicious people. Howdy, all of you delicious people. Yeah, so we're going to have an interesting setup because this is evidently this app that I've been doing reviews on. Yeah, changed a little bit. So we're going to have these bizarrish, awkward intros in every single one of my videos for who knows how long. Going in to this movie, immediately I had a severe hesitation about actually reviewing this film just because I had seen it so often. I had seen it a number of times. While I was watching this movie, I was actually kind of reciting some lines, thinking, like, yeah, does this line go like this and like that? And eventually it just, like, yeah, it was just, like, perfectly lined up. While rewatching this movie, I really took the time instead of actually focusing on the big things going on in the scene. I started focusing on like the background or the set pieces that more than likely some people might not have cared to notice. But there seems to be a lot of times when I think set pieces all of a sudden vanish or things get adjusted in the room, I guess, during certain takes. Especially if you are to look at the spot where J. Jonah Jameson is to be talking with view of his desk, we are to see a notepad that is to all of a sudden vanish at some point of a dialogue going on between people. There is also a lamp that is to get broken, reappears, and then vanishes in a later scene of a movie. I guess a lot of people could mention that uh, when Peter is to come back into his room, the background honestly looks slightly different from the original version of his room. Like, maybe they had to try to recreate this whole room, and this is what had happened for them to just go and, like, yeah, we're gonna just try to recreate a part of his room, but not the whole thing. We also have goofy things going on with times when we are to have the Green Goblin come into a building or in a home, or like every single time. How many numerous times does Green Goblin have to crash through a building? But that very first one like has a very like whoa kind of landing on J. Jonah Jameson's office when eventually that happens. There is also a goofy thing going on with an elevator where, like, the buttons of the elevator just seemed a little goofy or off to me. When eventually Peter Parker is to hit the elevator button. Really, I think I almost have kind of covered all of the goofy parts, but maybe there might be something that does jump out at me while we are to go through this review, and I will mention them as they go along, because there is some times where we are to quickly transition from one spot to the other, and it seems kind of out of place. It just feels like, oh, we go from what is to supposedly go to school to some other location, and that makes no sense. Uh, I also will try to provide some anecdotes that more than likely maybe some actor had said during the filming of this movie, or like little anecdotes. Maybe I'd probably watched the commentary or some video that was left up on YouTube about either Tobey Maguire or Sam Raimi talking about this movie and what they were putting together. Because God knows I watched any number of those videos to try to get any little side things about this film. Eventually, after watching the film, I think there was a bunch of featurettes that was also provided by this film as well. So, with that said, I thoroughly enjoy this franchise. Some people might laugh at some portions of it. Eventually, we'll get to really a dancing Tobey Maguire at some point if people are interested in this franchise. But here's the thing. The one thing that does stick out in this movie is the transition from live action to CGI. That obviously, like, painfully is showcasing itself when there is a CGI thing in a live action environment, aka Green Goblin for most of this film. But other than that, I think everything else could kind of fluffed off at some point. Other than that, yeah, like the thing that I loved about Spider-Man 3 compared to this one is every single thing of that movie seemed to be seamless, where you could not tell the difference between the live action and the jumping away Spider-Man that seemed quite perfect. But anyways, let's get into this film. Let's go and also say, hey, sweet for that Dr. Pepsi sponsorship that you guys had. And, like, cool that you guys made a ton of money off this movie from probably that spot. But anyways, let's go out of our way to go into that coveted double five timed spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this film, we are to have Peter tell you that this story, of course, is not for the faint of heart. That eventually he is to push on to show us a bunch of people that are on a bus who you are to naturally assume that the very first person that they pan to is Peter Parker, but it is not. That is Flash. And they zoom to another guy that Peter would rather be instead of himself, and eating a donut, and he drops some jelly out of the donut, and it's like, yeah, like, that's not me either. Peter is the guy chasing after the bus, screaming at the bus driver, hey, stop the bus. We have Mary Jane eventually rushing to the front of the bus, telling the bus driver he's been chasing us for numerous blocks, stop the bus. The bus driver stops the bus, everybody groans because they're like, oh, he's getting on the bus. Peter makes his way into the bus to eventually be tripped by one of Flash's friends. And then so eventually Peter does make it onto the bus, even though nobody wants to sit next to him. This bus bizarrely transitions from supposedly going to school to all of a sudden now going to a field trip. Does that goof or laugh or does that make sense to anyone? Doesn't mean to me. Bleep, that's all, folks. So this bus is to make its way to this field trip. Everybody is to get out. We have Harry, who is to, instead of going from the bus like any common person would, Harry is to drive in with Norman Osborn to Oscorp because that's where they're having their field trip. Norman is to pick Harry up, and Harry is to mention and to ask the driver, could they drive around? Norman is like, well, what? Like, what's the problem with having you come in like on my chariot? And Harry's like, come on. So Harry tries to duck out to try to greet Peter. Peter and Harry start talking. Norman eventually spots that Harry had left his backpack. Norman goes out to speak with both Harry and Peter. We start having this dialogue between Harry and Norman as if they are or have never met one another in Harry and Peter's longevous friendship. So Peter is to mention when he is to greet Norman that he had read one of his nano papers that he had wrote. And Norman is to ask, well, did you understand it? Peter says, yes, I wrote a paper on it myself. And Norman is like, well, seems like someone's a bit of a scientist. Well, I'm a bit of a scientist myself. Oh, yeah. That line delivery is so like goofy, but I love it. I'm somewhat of a scientist myself. There's gonna be some goofy line deliveries in some portions of this movie that you sometimes might cringe about, but you also might just be like, yeah. So Harry and Peter are eventually done talking with Norman. Norman is to go into Oscorp to eventually do his job. So we have the teacher that is explaining to everybody like what they are supposed to do in preparation for, hey, shut the heck up and listen to anybody that's gonna say any words, or you're gonna get a paddling. No. Like we have this teacher who is like nicely telling everybody that like, hey, everybody, tell everyone that, hey, don't get out of line and all kinds of jazz. Peter is to see Mary Jane. Mary Jane is to bizarrely look back at Peter as if she actually gives a rip about him. Peter is like, is she looking at me? Because I saw her like through her window earlier when I was looking out of my window before I was getting ready to go to school this morning. Or in some morning, maybe any morning, but anyways, every morning, Peter goes and sees Mary Jane wave what he is to think is at him. Peter waves back like, hey, and Mary Jane is actually waving at her friends, and Peter is looking awkward as if he is a person that waved at no one. So Harry and Peter are going into Oscorp. Peter is to mention that they have here the largest telescope of the eastern seaboard, and while the scientists are to explain to the rest of the class, because evidently Peter knows everything, a scientist is to mention about these super spiders, how there is supposedly 15 of them. Mary Jane notices that there are 14 of them, that evidently there is one missing. Peter is to mention to Harry, hey, like, speaking of spiders, like, there is one spider that is to change colors to reflect its background. It's a defense mechanism. And Harry's like, why would I even want to know that? And Peter's like, because it's cool. Thumbs up, buddy. Thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up, Harry. Do it. We have Peter who is trying to go in for a shot of these spiders, telling the scientist, hey, like, this is for the school yearbook. The scientist is like, okay, sure, go ahead. Take as many pictures as you want. Peter tries to take a photo. The same guy who had tripped Peter is the same guy who is to nudge Peter to make Peter mess up his photo taking. Harry comes in to mention to this goon, hey, how about you guys cut it out? And the Flash's friend is to mention, like, well, what are you going to do about it? Flash comes in to mention to his friend that it's like, well, his father is going to fire your father, so... The teacher is to come in and grab both Flash and his friend so that way Mary Jane can come up to start talking to Harry. Peter kind of stands back and kind of watches Harry talk to MJ. Harry repeats every single thing that Peter was to just tell him, so that way Harry can sound smart. Mary Jane is like, "Oh, that sounds really great that you told me all of that." And Harry is looking back at Peter like, "Huh?" And Peter is like, whatever. Harry is to eventually get also pulled away from the teacher because Harry and MJ were talking to one another during this scientist woman's entire presentation. So the teacher is going to grab Harry to talk about how they listen. Because even though Harry has been to a number of private schools, it's not the exact same kind of experience here. Peter decides, while Mary Jane is alone, to have her do pictures for the school yearbook. Mary Jane is to ask Peter, like, well, sure, but don't make me look ugly. Peter mentions that's impossible. So Peter and Mary Jane are having this moment with one another. They're looking at one another longingly, I'm sure, because that's how life is. Mary Jane doesn't even care. She's just like, oh, cool, somebody wants to take a photo of me? That's great. That's all that matters. MJ starts posing for Peter in these photos, just like, huh? It looks goofy, but it's all like everybody is awkward in this film. And we also have Peter, who, when we see in that bus scene in the very beginning of this, we know that Peter is really very like desperate to have his life change because Peter is invisible. Peter, and that seems obvious like during this field trip, Peter's invisible. No one really cares about him. If anything, he is just a butt of a joke. A guy that can just be bullied and pushed around because he's smaller than everyone else. And we're all to think of that while Peter is taking these photos of Mary Jane, realizing that this will probably be the girl that Peter will never get. Or will he? Peter is going and shooting these photos numerously of Mary Jane, so that way he can go and have a secret stash later on, a shrine of Mary Jane in his closet. I'm sure. No, he's not that weird. So MJ realizes that the group of students are starting to get away from her. So Mary Jane decides to go off and rejoin the group. Peter tries to stop Mary Jane by saying wait, but then he says thanks. Peter is not realizing that there is a spider that is starting to crawl onto his finger of where he had taken the shot from and bite onto his finger. And so Peter is like, ow. But then he's like, okay, let's go about my normal day. And so we transition to show what Norman is doing. Norman is talking to General Slocum about what new stuff they have been doing, how they have fixed the glider. The glider has much more improved, but General Slocum is like, well, that's great and all, but what advancements have you been making on your performance enhancers? We have Norman, who doesn't exactly have the answers, so he turns to Dr. Strom. Dr. Strom is like, well, I think we're going to need to take everything back to formula. We have Norman, who looks at Dr. Strom as a death stare to him, trying to smooth back over General Strom and get them to go off and and just be fine with everything. Peter is to, after this field trip is over and after his school day is over, make it back home. Here's one thing that I really started to notice for Peter Parker's character while watching this entire movie. This guy in this film never eats. Numerous times someone is to offer him a meal, but he never eats in this film. I don't know how many times you hear the words like, well, can I fix you something? And Peter is like, no. Or Peter mentions, like, no, I had a bite. And so there's a number of times where that just becomes a thing in this movie, and I don't know why. Like, was it a joke? Were they trying to fill that in somewhere as a joke to play on to people that did not realize that? What is going on in this movie? So Peter is to come home mentioning to both Uncle Ben and Aunt May that he is feeling sick. Uncle Ben had tried to put a light bulb in some fixture and mentioned to Aunt May, well, let there be light. Aunt May is to mention, well, hey, like, however you want to put that light bulb in is great, but hopefully you just don't fall on your batucas. Ben mentions, well, like, that's where I am, May. Like, I'm on my batucas. Like, we see Ben mention how he is to get laid off from his job, and that is to mean that basically he's on his butt or batucas because of him getting laid off. Aunt May mentions, well, like, we've had hard times before, and Ben is like, yeah, I get it. Peter is to come in mentioning that he's sick, that he wants to go to bed. They are to offer him a meal. He says, no, I had a bite. Ben is to ask Peter how the pictures came out, and Peter doesn't acknowledge that. He just continues to mention that he's going to go to his room. Everything is fine, but he's going to go to his room. Peter goes, takes off his shirt, and now he is skin and bones. Tobey Maguire was to tell us that this body of him much skinnier was legitimately Tobey Maguire's actual body. Eventually, when we are to see him later, he was to mention that he did legitimately work out to look in that that second time around shape. So, like, both of the, like, so there was probably quite a batch of time where Peter did have to adjust his body through filming of this movie, but no one noticed. No one cared. Here's also an anecdote. Tobey Maguire mentioned that when Defoe, who played Green Goblin, was to arrive in this movie, Tobey mentioned how, like, crazy in shape that Defoe was, and how he was really just impressed by just Defoe's physique. So Peter goes into his room and grabs his sheet, clutching to life, and he falls asleep, and there's a bunch of things all dazzling around in his head, all about super spiders and DNAs and all kinds of jazz. And we are also to have a person who is also going through another transformation himself. We have Norman talking to Dr. Strom, and they are going to try to fix the performance-enhancing drug that they are trying to perfect. Dr. Strom is mentioning, like, well, like, maybe we should wait 2 weeks and try to get the right test subject and this and that. We also have Dr. Strom at some point mentioning the side effects of what this performance enhancer can do. But Norman is like, well, 2 weeks, like, we can't wait 2 weeks. If anything, the aerospace company get is trying to get Norman out of business, and he can't delay any longer. So Norman is to have this thing being tested on himself. Norman is to go on and take some kind of liquid, and he is to, I guess that's the serum of whatever. Norman is to mention how in all the years that humans have lived, they haven't been able to grasp the real true form of human potential. I'm not saying that probably word for word, but whichever. Norman gets put it into this locking mechanism, this bizarrish thing. The funny thing Norman mentions is like, oh, it's cold. Strom puts him into this big, huge glass room for Storm to put in the gas. We have Norman, who is to start seizuring out, and eventually he is to flatline. Strom tries as quickly as possible to get Norman out of there and starts to bang on his chest to give him some kind of form of CPR. Norman comes back alive and grabs and tosses Strom, mentioning back to formula. We transition to Toby or Peter, who is to wake up to go to school, and he is to put on his glasses that no longer work perfectly for him. Peter is to look in the mirror, to look at his buff physique that absolutely has one nair hair anywhere on his upper body. Aunt May is to ask Peter, well, hey, are you feeling better? Is there a change? And Peter is to mention, yeah, big change. Peter comes running down the stairs, eventually to jump over the stairs, and Ben is like, oh, you must be feeling better. And Peter's like, yeah, well, Ben mentions, is like, hey, Michelangelo, just remember that you and me are painting the kitchen tonight. And Peter mentions, is well, hey, like, don't start without me. And Ben's like, well, yeah, well, don't start with me. Also, we have Ben, who is to mention to Aunt May, it's like, hey, raging teenage hormones, like, that's gotta be it. Peter is to walk to the bus stop to see Mary Jane get picked up by one of her friends. Peter is to again chase after the bus for the second time, but eventually does go to school. Peter eventually quickly goes from bus to lunch. Peter sits down and sees that Mary Jane is coming in and is to slip and almost fall. Peter is to transition to grab Mary Jane and grab this tray with every single piece of this, of what stuff that Mary Jane had on her tray. Here's the thing about this scene. There was no CGI of this scene. Toby had to catch every single one of these things on this tray. It evidently took a large number of takes to finally get this scene right. And luckily they did. Or more than likely, they would have probably just CGI'd it all in. But Toby did actually catch every single thing. And so some people might be like, no, that's a lie. Like, Toby was just making that up to look cool. Yeah, I'm sure he was trying to desperately look cool when he's freaking Spider-Man. Peter is to try and eat his lunch, but Peter accidentally is to web his lunch. Accidentally taking and trying to get his hand from this webbing, flinging the tray, hitting Flash. Flash is to look at anybody but Peter at this cafeteria of where the heck that this lunch tray had come from. Not directly behind him. He looks directly like off to the side somewhere, which I thought was weird. Peter is to drag this tray around with him with webbing, and Flash is to find that weird. But Flash is to also go chasing after Peter so he can beat him up. Flash is to see Peter at this locker, so Peter is to all of a sudden stop and see every single thing that is to come his way around him. And one of those things is Flash's fist to hit him in, I guess, the back of the head or in the back or somewhere. Peter, of course, dodges this punch and starts to dodge every single thing, to the point of Peter doing these weird moves that don't actually make sense. A lot of people are starting to get very weirded or freaked out, but Peter is to take Flash's arm, grab it, and then eventually punch Flash to a pretty good distance. And so we have Peter after this that is to try and understand his power. Go and try to go into a dark alley to realize that his hands now can crawl up walls. We have Peter experimenting to try to understand his web swinging ability. Peter is to mention a number of different sayings to be able to try to channel this whole web ability. We have him mention Shazam. We have him mention Go Web Go. Fly away, Web. Peter just flips his wrist, and eventually Web is to come out attached to a crane, and Peter is to go, well, tally-ho. Peter goes flying, and sadly enough, he cannot figure out where the heck to go next. So he is to smash into a wall and fall over. So Peter is to head back home to notice a note from Ben saying, "Hey, Michelangelo, food is in the oven." So Peter is to go and take out the trash. And to meet Mary Jane. Mary Jane is fighting with her father, and of course it seems that this is a home that people consistently yell in it. Mary Jane is to ask Peter, it's like, well, I'm sure you heard that, and Peter's like, well, everyone shouts. Mary Jane is to mention, like, well, I'm sure, like, your aunt and uncle don't shout. And Peter's like, well, they get in some pretty good screaming matches. And Peter asks Mary Jane, well, what are you going to do after school is out? Like, are you going to head to the city and Mary Jane is like, well, yeah, like city, like if anything, she asks or she tells Peter that she wants to act. And Peter's like, well, of course, because you were good in all the school plays. I cried when you played Cinderella. Mary Jane is like, you into all those, you freak! I'm out of here. Goodbye. I will never be kissing you any part of this movie. And credits roll, Peter's heart is crushed and he dies. Movie ends. No. But that's what she should have said. You freak! You weirdo! You stalker guy! Mary Jane eventually asks Peter what he is going to do. Peter mentions, I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big. And that's when we have Flash, who is to come in and yell to Mary Jane to come into his car. So Mary Jane runs off to see Flash's new car. We have uh, Toby or Peter mention, like, hey, cool car. And of course, we immediately have Peter, who is to try to think up a costume for himself. Because immediately he's like, dude, I want to get a box car with a couple grand. It's going to be awful looking. It's not going to be as cool as what I dreamed. That's all of a sudden going to win over Mary Jane once I buy a car. So Peter goes into costume designs, trying to think of the best thing to put together. Does one sketch with a lot of black. He says he draws needs more color. He also has to figure out the symbol. So Peter, and here's the goofy thing about Peter's costumes. How in the heck does this guy design these costumes in this movie? It never made sense to me how this guy consistently has all these kind of costumes. Doesn't make sense. But, it is what it is. Peter is to go and have a costume so he can go to a wrestling contest because he is to see a $3,000 reward for anyone who is to wrestle for 3 minutes. Peter is like, well, I don't have the skill, but I have the muscle, so let's go and see if I can kind of win or lose or whatever and get some kind of money, hopefully. Peter is to, I guess, start to have or give both Ben and Aunt May some concern. Ben is to mention, well, like, maybe there's something going on with Peter that, like, he's too nervous to mention, and maybe I'm too nervous to come and ask him. And Peter is to tell both Ben and May that he is going to go to the library. And Ben is like, well, hey, I'll drive you, to try and see if, like, he can then talk to Peter. Aunt May and Ben do this, like, weird, like, thumbs up thing, or whichever, like, to just, like, like, I'm gonna talk to him now, and May's like, great, go on, go ahead. Like, that weird staring thing that both of them do. Ben drives Peter to the library, where he does not actually go in there. But Ben, before they get into this library, we have Ben give him this morality speech, kind of mentioning about what has been going on with Peter lately, about the fight that he had been in, and we have Peter mentioning, well, I didn't start that fight, but Ben is like, well, you sure finished it. Ben is like trying to uh, like give him this speech and telling him with great power is great responsibility. And Ben is telling Peter, it's like, well, yeah, I know I'm not your father. And Peter is saying, well, stop pretending to be. Pretty much throwing whatever Ben is to say to uh, Peter, which is important to Peter, is like, dude, I have superpowers now. I don't want to hear any of this. Because Ben is like, well, I don't mean to lecture and I don't mean to preach. But yeah, it's like, but Ben really is like trying to like say something important here, and Peter is just like, dude, I just want to go to my wrestling match and try to fight Bonesaw for 3 minutes. Peter goes to the library. Ben is to wait for Peter. Peter is to run off to go to this wrestling match. So Peter is to sign up for this wrestling match. There's a woman at this desk that is to maybe be familiar to some people because she's a pretty decent actress. She's to mention that there is no featherweight division and that when he signs up, he realizes that anything that is to happen to him is not their fault, and Peter signs. So we have a ring announcer that could be familiar to a lot of people because we have a lot of times where a lot of the people that Sam Raimi has worked with usually pops into a movie, and it really shows in this film. Bruce Campbell is to do the ring announcing. Of course, Ash from Evil Dead and a number of other movies that he has done. Ash goes on to announce that Bonesaw had beaten someone and that his next contestant is going to be the Flying Dutchman. The Flying Dutchman goes out to easily and quickly get creamed by Bonesaw, who is, of course, Macho Man Randy Savage from mostly just kind of WCW because I don't think he ever really went to WWE. I could be wrong. But technically, they're kind of one and the same. Because bought out by one. So Macho Man is to give his coveted elbow drop in this movie, but that I think is going to be the only real iconic maneuver that Macho Man is going to be delivering in this movie that is actually his. We see the ring announcer going to announce the name of the next person who is to be Peter Parker. We have the ring announcer ask what Peter Parker's name is. Peter Parker mentions that it's the Human Spider. The ring announcer says, Human Spider, that's a crappy name. So the ring announcer is to announce the deadly, the amazing Spider-Man. So Peter is like, dude, he said my name wrong. Like, I'm the Human Spider. But they push him out there anyways, because he's going to get dead in like a second. Peter Parker starts strolling along to see the Buzzettes or the Bonettes, however bizarrish name that these chatterers or these promo characters have bizarrely. They are talking smack to Spider-Man. So Spider-Man makes his way into this match. We have Bonesaw, of course, mentioning, Bonesaw's ready! I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes of playtime! Because, of course, Macho Man is always really good at giving us a line to remember. Peter does not realize it, but all of a sudden, this match is to all of a sudden become a cage match where it's like a no-holds-barred cage match where I guess you can bring in weapons into this thing. Maybe it's like an HELL in a cell, but I guess no rules apply with this cage match. So Spider-Man is to fling up into the air to try and get away from Buzzsaw. So we consistently have Peter who is trying to dodge Buzzsaw, but eventually Buzzsaw is to grab a chair to smack Peter with, and Peter eventually falls to the ground, but eventually gets back up. Peter is to try and take down Buzzsaw repetitiously with these kicks, and eventually with this monkey flip that is to crash Buzzsaw into the cage and have him get knocked out, which is to have the 1, 2, 3 and have it be the winner of this match be Spider-Man. The only thing is we don't actually have Peter Parker who is to pin Buzzsaw, and normally there would be actually a 10 count, not a 1, 2, 3, unless Peter actually just had his foot over Buzzsaw, and I guess they just counted that as a pin. The referee is to throw Spider-Man's arms up. Everyone in this wrestling match is to yell out the word Spider-Man because I guess that is everyone's new favorite. And Peter is like, oh my god, like the roar of the crowd. This is amazing. Peter is to go back in the back, and he is to only get $100. Peter mentions the ad is 3,000, and the guy who's handing out money is like, well, look again, webhead. The ad says $3,000 for 3 minutes, and you pinned him in 2. And Peter mentions, well, I needed that money, and the money guy is like, well, I missed the part where that's my problem. Peter is to go out of this spot to just hit the elevator. All of a sudden, there is a guy running like crazy with all the money from this wrestling promotion. And it is this iconic man that will be forever known as the guy who put the boots to Uncle Ben, supposedly. Spider-Man 3. Go ahead and watch that one. Peter is to dodge completely out of the way of this guy running with this money. We have the robber who is to say thanks as the elevator is to close. The wrestling promoter who had the money and this police officer is to mention hey, you could have stopped that guy. And of course Peter is like, well, I missed the part where that's my problem. Peter goes to get back to Uncle Ben to find out that Ben's car is missing, but there is a ton of people who are circling around something. Ben goes in to see that there is police there, so Peter checks it out to find out that Uncle Ben is lying on the ground with a pillow to his head, and he has been shot. Ben mentions to Peter, so Peter is to hold on to Ben's hand as he is to die, and this is a really sad moment. Peter wants to track down where exactly this shooter of Ben is to be located. So Peter goes and puts on every single bit of his wrestling attire to go and track this guy down. He is to follow the flashing lights of the police and needs to forcibly use his webbing for the second time. And he's kind of hesitant about doing it, but he's like, dude, I need to figure this out. Peter starts to schling, and he doesn't know how exactly he's going to make transitions, but eventually he does. And so Peter is going and swinging pretty well for the first time, tracking down exactly where this car is to head, and eventually is to jump on top of the car for this car to crash into this spot for the thug to run into this building and have Peter follow him. Peter goes to this thug, and the thug is like, well, hey, wait a minute, like, give me a chance. Peter mentions, like, well, did you give my uncle a chance when you shot him? Peter realizes that this thug is none other than the exact same thug who is to run out of this wrestling promotion with this money. And Peter now realizes that the robber is to go and take a gun to Peter's head, saying, see ya. Peter is to break this guy's hand, and eventually this guy is to fall from out of this window to fall to his death. Peter has a light from a boat that is to shine on this building, and the police were going to try and get to him, thinking that this mass assailant must have taken down this guy. But Peter vanishes before the cops arrive into this building. And so that is to cover that scene. So after this, we are to have Peter eventually go and have Ben's funeral. Or no. Yeah, like we have Ben's funeral, and then we have I want to try to get this right, because I'm trying to think which is the very first thing that pops up. So, General Slocum is to talk to the people at Airspace that are putting together the exoskeleton. They are to do a demonstration, and Slocum is definitely wanting to put the boots to Norman if this thing is to work out. So they are to do this this experiment, and we have immediately where all of a sudden there is this goblin that is to arrive to take down this exoskeleton and throw a bomb into him. Evidently, this armored man was completely having any ability to fire any weapon before this goblin was to appear, showcasing honestly how bad he actually was going to be in any kind of fight, because I guess this was just a prototype that probably wasn't working all that well. Goblin is to kill the exoskeleton man, and Green Goblin is to also kill General Slocum, as well as any number of these Air Force people, or airspace people, whichever they're called. Norman is to wake up the next day with Harry grabbing Norman's body, saying, like, are you okay? Like, did you fall? And Norman is kind of completely oblivious of what had happened the night before. Cue us having Norman go to his work to find out that they are giving him the boot. They're giving him 30 days. because since that accident with Air Force, uh, they are trying to buy Norman's company completely out, and Norman is now out because Air Force the airspace company is desperate. So we have all these old fat cats. I think one of them is like one guy is named like Fargo, uh, like Mr. Fargo, and one of them is like it doesn't matter. Like it's not a big thing. But we have one guy who's like, "Yeah, Norman, you're out," and then he takes like this sip of his like tea, like going like, "Yeah, I'm gonna take this one last victory slurp, and then I'm gonna get out of here because I don't want to see your face anymore." Norman is like, "Well, am I out? Am I really out? Am I?" We're going and so we they're having, I guess, this Macy's Day Parade, this variation of it, because it's close to Thanksgiving. So they're having some parade, they're throwing some big hoopla. Harry is to want to showcase his girlfriend, who is Mary Jane, off to his father. Harry is kind of like at Mary Jane because Mary Jane is wearing a red dress, and Harry mentions uh, uh, to Mary Jane, "Well, hey, my dad likes black. He likes black dresses." MJ is like, "Well, maybe like your father will just like me, and that'll be good enough." So Peter is to just take shots of the parade, getting a pretty decent shot at MJ and Harry together at this balcony. Uh, so that is to go on. We have all of a sudden something new flying in. Because we have Harry who is to ask, I think, Mr. Fargo, "Well, hey, like, is my father coming to this?" And he's like, "You know what? I think your father's going to be, like, out of this one. I don't think he's coming." But he will. Green Goblin is to make his way from a far distance on to make it to this parade and go and kill off every single one of his executives, his guys who uh, had control of this company but aren't anymore because they're going to be dead. Every one of them bulletins and fall over. Green Goblin is to yell to them, "Out, am I?" and kills them off. Eventually, the balcony is to start to crack. Mary Jane is to eventually uh, almost have a piece of this balcony fall with her on it. She's yelling and screaming. Harry gets knocked on the head with some rock to fall over. Peter is to rush to rip off his shirt, Superman style, to find somewhere where he is to change into Spider Man, while everybody is running around like crazy. Spider Man is to eventually see that Green Goblin is on the ground trying to surrender to police officers. So Peter comes into the fray and punches Green Goblin, and Green Goblin goes, "Exciting," or like, or like he says, like, I think he says exciting or he says interesting. Uh, I think he said exciting. Uh, Green Goblin grabs Peter's punch and then punches him to have him hit a pole where this pole is to hit some other guy. So all this anarchy is going crazy. There is some kid who is to almost get crushed by uh, some thing that is coming at him of some float or something. Peter has to scramble to go and try to tell this kid to move, and he won't. So Peter goes and grabs him to give him back to his mother. Peter starts bouncing from float to float, or from balloon to balloon, like giant balloons, so he can make it to MJ, who is screaming out for someone to help her. Spider-Man jumps from balloon to balloon, but Goblin grabs him and shoves him into a wall. So Peter eventually gets away from the Goblin to web him up. Then Peter grabs MJ as she is to fall. Spider-Man is to grab her and sling her over to safety and onto a rooftop where Mary Jane is like, well, hey, like, do I know who you are? And Spider-Man's like, well, hey, you know who I am. I'm your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And so he runs off like a boss. Like the whole, like, I love you, I know. And the whole, like, way of just kind of, like doing these, like, cool little, like, oh, now she wants you. She, like, desperately wants you. But I'm going to pause here for a second so I can reset here for a second because I've been talking for an hour. Reset achieved. So, after this fight out, we are to see that Spider-Man is really starting to put the boots to a lot of bank robbers and a lot of common crime. And the newspapers are kind of desperately clamoring to try to be able to get a picture of this guy because Spider-Man is way too fast. J. Jonah Jameson is to mention that they're going to put off a big money reward for any pictures of Spider-Man. But Jonah is kind of really like back and forth about whether this guy is a hero or a villain or not. And so people are trying to like talk him into like just be like, hey, like I think he's on our side kind of thing, but not so much. Peter is to see in a newspaper that there's a big money reward for pictures of Spider-Man, so of course, what does Peter do? He is to go like, well, I'm Spider-Man, I can take my own pictures. So Peter, of course, takes pictures of himself, basically, hands them in to J. Jonah Jameson, and calls himself a photographer. Peter is to give Jonah shots of him doing his crimes. So J. Jonah is to mention, like, well, hey, like, all these are crap, mega crap. Like, I'll give you $200 for them. To just kind of lowball the price. Peter's like, well, hey, like, sir, I really need this money. And so Jonah says, well, like, okay, I'll give you $300. That's a standard freelance fee. Here's the goofy thing. So Jonah mentions that there's a big money prize for any picture of Spider-Man, but then he also lowballs Peter of the price of these pictures, but he still also gives him like the bare minimum of everyone else. So big money, not exactly. So Peter is to take, or Jonah is to take one of Peter's photos and have them rip up the first page one to adjust it to say whether Spider-Man is a hero or a menace, because Jonah is to keep saying that Spider-Man is a public menace And Robert is to butt heads with Jonah, saying he's not a menace. So Hoffman is to come in to have Hoffman tell Betty that he is to give uh, Peter his check. Peter goes to get his check from Betty. Here's an interesting thing. So Peter and Betty, these two actresses, actually have another movie that they had done quite a while later called The Details. Bizarrely, it's a movie about Tobey Maguire who is to sleep with other women besides his wife, and also he is to have a large problem with this raccoon that is to consistently mess up his backyard, to the point of Tobey Maguire figuring out a way to try to get rid of this raccoon in this movie. I don't know why it is, but like there's some like Caddyshack-esh like thing going on there that just seems weird. But pushing on. Green Goblin is to break into Jonah's office to ask where he gets pictures from Spider-Man. Jonah mentions that everything that is given to him is given through the mail, which is a lie. Peter crashes in himself to try and see what he can do to help Jonah. Jonah is to say that both Goblin and Spider-Man are in cahoots. Peter webs him to say, hey, like, Mom and Dad are having a talk here. Green Goblin goes and puts out his hands to tell Spider-Man to sleep. Goblin grabs Peter and takes him on a rooftop to have a little bit of dialogue with him. So Peter is to wake up because Goblin is to say so. Goblin is to try and make Peter or Spider-Man an offer that that Spider-Man is going to refuse because because what he's doing is wrong. Goblin mentions it's like, well, like I chose my path, you chose the way of the hero. For everything that you do for these people, eventually they will hate you. So Green Goblin is to mention to Peter, like, well, like, how about you, like, join with me? Like, if we, like, we are both exceptional people, and if we were to join forces, like, they could rule this town. And Goblin is waiting for Peter's answer. And so Peter is to brush off. So Peter is to eventually go and start walking around town to eventually, one, see that Mary Jane at some point in this movie is working for a place called Moondance Coffee. And it's not exactly what Mary Jane had really wanted to do. But Peter is going to keep it a secret between him and Mary Jane. And Mary Jane is telling Peter that, yeah, like, keep this secret and don't tell Harry. Because Peter is like, well, why shouldn't I tell Harry? Mary Jane mentions that both of them are together and that Harry probably didn't tell her, or Harry didn't probably tell Peter, I guess. So Peter is to go and say, as Mary Jane is to leave, well, like, hey, maybe I'll go and try one of your Moondance coffees or like, it's kind of interesting that whole actual diner is a real legitimate place that Mary Jane was to come through. I guess that's a real spot in New York. So that's kind of interesting. Uh, Push on. Peter is to bump into Mary Jane again in the streets. Uh, Peter is to mention to Mary Jane, well, hey, how about you and me? Like, we go out and we have a cheeseburger, like a cheeseburger that has to be at least $7 and X amount of cents. Mary Jane is like, well, I'd like a cheeseburger, but sadly enough, me and Harry are going to dinner. How about you come along? Peter's like, nah, uh, he's like, nah, like I don't want to be a third wheel, but hey, how is that relationship going? And he kind of hesitates and is like, well, maybe I shouldn't have asked. And Mary Jane is like, well, like, like, why are you asking? So that conversation eventually fizzles out. Mary Jane leaves to eventually go down a dark alley where she's not supposed to. There's a bunch of guys who are doing cat calls. Uh, Peter is to naturally assume that Mary Jane is going to get in trouble, so he dons his Spider-Man costume. At one point, Mary Jane does call Peter Superman, but not the same thing. Spider-Man is to watch as Mary Jane is to start to have a number of guys follow her into a dark alley and start to grab on her. Spider-Man jumps into action to try and beat up a lot of these men. And then after that, Peter is to almost vanish, to eventually reappear while Mary Jane is to say, like, wait. Spider-Man is to reappear to mention to Mary Jane, well, you have a knack for getting in trouble. And Mary Jane mentions, like, you have a knack for saving my life. Am I going to thank you this time around? And then, of course, we have the coveted kiss scene. Because Mary Jane mentions that, like, I think I have a superhero stalker. And Peter is like, well, like, the line of dialogue has him say, like, well, it's always nice to have a fan because Mary Jane really likes him, whichever. I don't remember the line, but in between that. So Mary Jane thanks him with an upside down kiss. Here's also the weird, bizarre thing. Mary Jane is to consistently be wet in both this movie and the sequel film. Bizarrely, like, we have this rain sequence where she is to be wet to where you're basically having a certain kind of almost see-through moment going on bizarrely. And then Mary Jane is to also, in the sequel film, bizarrely be wet for some reason I don't quite exactly understand. I don't know what it is. I don't know what is with her and consistently being, like, wet and showing it. I guess this scene was justifiable, but also, whichever. Peter goes and zips off to have Mary Jane go, like, yeah, like, I guess he's my my new home slice squeeze whatever, I hope. Next thing we know is that there is a burning building afoot. Peter is to go to, and I think I'm kind of skipping around some like little things of dialogue here and there. I think I am kind of skipping around about the whole Norman. Yeah, I think I am. Let's backpedal. Norman eventually is to eventually be talking to himself because his self is finally going to like showcase himself to Norman. So Norman is to hear a voice in his home that is to sound like his own. Norman is to ask who's there, and of course, Goblin is to tell Norman, like, you know who it is. Like, stop being naive. If anything, you know full well. And so Norman is to ask where this individual is, and Goblin is to mention, well, follow the cold, shivering spine movement, and you'll figure it out. So Norman is to go into one place he would not think someone would appear, and that is a mirror. So we start having a dialogue between both Goblin and Norman, mentioning what their next steps are, and also mentioning how, like, Goblin had taken everyone out of Norman's way. So, like, really, they are to see what the next steps are and eventually get to Spider-Man at some point. So, burning building. Peter is to go and rescue a child that is to be in a burning building because a wife had forgotten her baby in a burning building. Spider-Man is to easily go and take this baby and give it to this woman. A police officer is to arrive and want to arrest Spider-Man, but there is another person in this building. The cop is to tell Spider-Man that, hey, like, go and get this person. I'll be here when you get back. Peter's like, I'm not coming back. So Peter goes on to see what the last person is in this burning building. It's kind of interesting how I think at some point we also consistently have burning buildings in this franchise. Maybe like the first and second film, but I don't know if there's like a burning building in the third movie somewhere. But more than likely there probably is. Spider-Man is trying to track where the sound is coming from, and it is to come from a lady with some kind of shawl or hood on of some kind. Peter is to grab this woman to have him realize that this is actually Goblin instead. Goblin is to go and try to toss a number of punches and things at Peter. And Goblin is to ask, like, well, like, what did you think of my offer? Peter says, no, you gotta be out of your mind, Gobby. So Goblin is to throw a number of weapons at Peter. He dodges them all, but eventually gets cut in the arm. And so Peter is to eventually just try and dodge as much as attacks that he can from Green Goblin. But then Peter and Goblin are to eventually separate, and Goblin is to mention, like, well, no one says no to me. So now we have the Thanksgiving debacle. Norman is to arrive with Harry to Thanksgiving with Aunt May, Peter, and Mary Jane. Mary Jane is now wearing black, of course, because evidently Norman likes black. I guess she's trying to put a good first impression, because the first time they didn't actually meet one another. So Peter is to arrive later with like a can of cranberries that he had to Like he had to like kind of like shake a stick at a old lady to get this can of cranberries. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Uh, so they are to set up to all start doing Thanksgiving. So so Norman is to all of a sudden start picking at some of the food. Aunt May is to slap him, mention that like, hey, uh, like save that, save it up. How about you like prepare some food? So we have Norman who is sharpening the knives. Aunt May is to notice that Peter has a cut on his arm. Peter is to make up a story about a bike messenger that had knocked him down. Because here is also the thing: Norman, uh, Norman had looked at Peter's arm, and the cut looks very familiar. Peter was also gone while Norman was making his way to Peter's apartment, and Peter was to crawl his way in to his room, and everybody might have thought that Peter might have been here already, but he wasn't. Peter goes and hangs on his ceiling while Norman and everybody are to check his room, and not seeing or spotting Peter. Peter is to drop a thing of blood for no one to notice. So cranberries, a can of cranberries. That's what it was. Uh, Peter is to mention the story to Norman. Norman is to leave about the whole bike messenger story that feels like a lie because he knows something. So Norman is to leave because it feels like he's transitioning from normal Norman to Goblin, so he needs to get the heck out of there. Norman starts to walk out, and Harry's like, "Well, no, like stay here. Like I wanted you to meet my girlfriend." And Norman is to mention as he is to make his way to the elevator that, uh, like, all these girls are all the same. They're going to be sniveling after your trust fund. Uh, do whatever you want with her, but then broom her fast. So Norman is to leave off the elevator as his eyes are rolling back in his head. Harry is to go back in to, I guess, try to salvage this Thanksgiving. Mary Jane is to mention that that uh, how could Norman say any of that? Harry is to come to his father's defense, mentioning that, hey, I wish one day I could be half the man that my father is. So that is really starting to put a wrench in Mary Jane's and Harry's relationship already. So, uh, so we transition here. We have now Green Goblin who is to understand that Peter Parker is Spider Man. So Norman is to talk to the helmet of Green Goblin to ask, like, what is the next step? What should we do? So the Goblin helmet is to tell Norman that they need to attack at Harry's heart, make him weak, make him wish he were dead, and then grant his wish. So Norman is to go after Aunt May, go and crash into her home, flame it all up, while Aunt May is before she is to go to bed, make a prayer. And Goblin crashes in while Aunt May is to not finish this prayer, demanding that she finishes it, for Aunt May to mention that to deliver us from evil. So Aunt May is to end up in the hospital, and Peter is to make his way there. It seems that the doctors are checking in Aunt May. Aunt May is to mention about these horrible yellow eyes. Oh, what a world. And so Peter immediately is like, yellow eyes, like Goblin nose. Crap. So Peter is by Aunt May's bedside until Mary Jane is to show up. So Mary Jane is to ask Aunt May's condition. Then eventually Mary Jane is to ask about Harry and her's relationship, because we have Harry who had gotten a phone call from MJ saying that Spider-Man was incredible, and Harry wanted to go to a store and buy her something because it'll make her feel good, meaning it'll make him feel good to think that he can buy her off with gifts. And that happens earlier on after the whole Mary Jane first time being rescued by Spider-Man. Mary Jane is to mention to Peter that yeah, me and Harry, but if anything, I am gonna be a girl with a school crush. And Peter is like, oh, will I know this man? Knowing exactly where she is going to head. So Mary Jane mentions, well, he saved my life twice and I don't even know his name. And Parker is like, oh, that guy. And Mary Jane is like, yeah, you're laughing at me. Peter is like, well, no, I can see how, he's really cool. I'm kind of his official photographer. If anything, I talk to him sometimes. And MJ's like, well, did he ask about me? And, of course, now we have Peter who has to bring up this huge line of dialogue of, trying to come up with some, improvisable thing of him talking to Spider-Man. And so Peter mentions that, he asked me about you, and I said that that if anything, when you look into her eyes and she looks at yours, it's not quite normal. That that sometimes you feel terrified and stronger when you're with her. I'm paraphrasing here. That she is this unobtainable thing, and that all of this speech that he is to play out and lay out and whichever, that she is this Mount Everest of a person that that he is to try to lay on Mary Jane for her to just be like, huh? Mary Jane is to grab Peter's hand. All of a sudden, Harry is to come in, realizing that this is happening, and so he is to walk out. So eventually Mary Jane is to leave. Peter is to talk to Aunt May and talk about that Peter is doing too much. He's not Superman, you know. Aunt May is to mention how that the first time he had ever met Mary Jane, that she was an angel, and Spider-Man, or Peter is mentioning, did I say that? Pushing on. Harry is to go to his father's home to mention, well, I guess, MJ, Dad, you were right about MJ. It seems that Mary Jane is eventually falling for Peter. He's had a crush on her since, the third grade. and there's no one that he cares for more but her. So Norman realizes that, and he's like, well, like, I guess this is my fault because I've never been there for you. And Harry's like, well, hey, like, you've been busy. I understand. Uh, but Norman is trying to comfort his son. And so Peter is talking to Aunt May, and Aunt May is to mention to Peter, well, you know what? Like, how about you finally confess to Mary Jane your feelings? Because everybody else knows that, like, you like one another. Like, everybody knows. So Peter is realizing that more than likely someone will figure that out too and want to get to Mary Jane. Peter rushes to a phone to call Mary Jane. Uh, he gets her answering machine. He tells her to not go through any dark alleys. Green Goblin is to answer said phone and say, hey, can Spider-Man come out to play? Peter rushes to make it to where Green Goblin is, because Green Goblin is at some bridge where he is holding Mary Jane, and he is shortly going to take out this ski lift looking thing. I don't know exactly what the title of this is. I always call it ski lift. The little like travel-esh like things that like people go from like spot to spot through these like little like these ski lift looking things. Uh, Goblin is to take that down, and he is to grab the wire that is holding uh, this lift thing from falling into the ocean. I guess this is probably the bridge between like New York and Manhattan. Maybe I don't know. I don't know much about New York, but it could be any number of places. It could be not New York at all. So Peter is to see what Goblin is doing from a distance because he's like, you know what, I'm just gonna not do anything. Like, I'm just gonna sit here and wait till Goblin really does something horrible, and then I will sling my way into action. Peter goes and webs two flags to try and slingshot his way to make it to Goblin. Peter makes it to this bridge to have uh, Goblin mention, well, there is always a man that is going to come with a sadistic choice. And so now, like, you will have to choose between the girl or the children. So now choose. Peter immediately jumps into action to grab Mary Jane and then decides to get both because it's like the Batman Forever scenario where Batman tells the Riddler, well, like, hey, uh, like I can be Batman and Bruce Wayne because it's not because I want to be, it's because I choose to be. Peter goes, grabs both the wire that is holding these kids in this lift thing, and Mary Jane all at the same time. Peter goes and webs the bridge so that way he has like one arm holding the bridge and one arm holding these people. There's a boat that is going to come through and try to come in and try to save these kids and have Spider-Man slide this thing down so these kids can be protected. And we have Peter that is desperately telling Mary Jane that she needs to slide down. Here's the thing that I'm thinking of with this rope. I've seen the movie Frozen where like three kids are on this ski lift And there was one guy who tries to grab this wire with his hands, and he cuts his hands all the way through this rope. So I'm thinking or assuming that that rope, as Mary Jane is trying to go down it, is going to cut her hands all the way through, to where she doesn't have hands anymore. But Goblin is to consistently try to hit Peter and have Spider-Man consistently lose this rope that is holding on to everyone. Eventually, Mary Jane is to consistently slide more and more down this rope and almost fall off this thing completely. So, Goblin is to eventually be met by every New Yorker on this bridge, who is to fling crap at him to distract Goblin, because these people are mentioning, it's like, well, if you're going to mess with one New Yorker, if you're going to mess with one of us, you're going to mess with all of us. So Goblin gets hit with all kinds of crap. So Peter goes and slides this thing down to this boat, I guess called the barge. So the kids are safe, Mary Jane's safe. They all get out of this lift thing to look up at Spider-Man going and trying to fight off Goblin. So Peter and Goblin go fighting along to have Peter, I think, or Spider-Man web up Goblin's glider, and so they end up going crashing through this building. Peter is to eventually smash through a number of different things on his way through this building, and Goblin is to toss a bomb into the fray, and it is pretty near close to Peter, so Peter starts losing a bunch of his costume, but it seems that we are to have this big showdown at this point. So, really, of course, Goblin is to come in and really just start, like, beating the crap out of Spider-Man. Really, the thing that kind of just irks me about this whole franchise is to honestly to hear, like, Tobey Maguire and his, like, painful, like, grunts, where he's like, like, it honestly just sounds a little weird, and I wish that they would have taken that out. But I guess they probably, recorded, like, a billion of these, like, grunts and whatever. Who knows? I'm kind of curious if they, like, recorded a number of all of these lines over from both Goblin and Peter, because I'm sure nobody could hear what the heck is going on with either one of these masks through this entire film. So Goblin is to just be beating Peter so badly that he is to choke Peter and to mention, well, hey, like, me and Mary Jane, like, we're gonna have a hell of a time. Because at first I was going to, I was gonna kill her quick, but now that you really pissed me off, like, I'm gonna finish her nice and slow. Spider-Man sees this weapon coming. He grabs it from Goblin and is now showing off to Goblin that Spider-Man, when Mary Jane's life is on the line, that he is going to start countering Goblin and start beating the living crap out of Goblin. Just really, like, start punching and kicking, and then really just also, like, go and web up, like, swing around and start hitting Goblin over and over and over, to have Goblin get near this wall for Peter to web the wall, shove it down. And so Peter grabs Goblin and just starts punching him over and over until Norman is to desperately ask Peter to stop. Like, it's me, Norman. So Peter has his guard down. And so Norman is to take off Peter's mask. And, so Peter is to mention, it's like, well, you've killed numerous people, and Goblin is to mention, like, well, it wasn't me, it was the Goblin. Like, if anything, I didn't want to do it. And so Goblin is asking Peter, like, hey, like, I've been like a father to you, be a son to me now. And Peter is like, well, I had a father, his name was Ben Parker. So we have Goblin who's like, well, Godspeed, Spider-Man. Of course, Spider-Man is to see the Goblin glider being set up from behind him that is going to come and take him out. So Peter jumps and flips backward out of the way for this glider to hit Norman, as Norman is like, whoops, and gets hit with the glider. So we are to now have Norman bleed to death. So Norman's last desperate act to Peter is, Peter, don't tell Harry. And so Norman drops onto the glider to die. Peter is to take Norman back to Harry's place without the Goblin outfit on to try to keep Norman's secret. But Harry is to see Spider-Man bring in Norman, and Harry is to try to do something, but Spider-Man leaves too soon. So we have this movie that I think I kind of covered most of everything. This movie all ends with Norman's funeral. And Peter is to comfort Harry, as Harry is to claim that he is going to kill Spider-Man. And so after this whole funeral has gone on, we have Peter who eventually walks to see Ben Parker's gravestone. Mary Jane is to have walked over to Peter, and we have holy crap, almost 2 hours. I gotta get done with this quick. Holy crap, I didn't realize I was gonna be talking this long. So Mary Jane is to talk to Peter and ask if he misses him, and Peter, of course, says yes. So Mary Jane is to confess to Peter that, when she was about to die, that the one face that she wanted to see one more time was, of course, Peter Parker's. And so Mary Jane goes and tries to kiss Peter, and Peter mentions, like, well, I can't tell you everything. There's so much to tell. And Peter says, like, I will always be there for you. I will always be your friend. And Mary Jane is like, well, is that all? And Peter's like, well, for now. So Mary Jane sees Peter walk off, and when Mary Jane is to kiss Peter Parker, she is to all of a sudden touch her lips and go, huh? Like, his kiss feels familiar. Upside down? Yes, but still familiar. I wonder why. Peter walks off. Like, you would have thought right after that moment, Mary Jane would have been like figuring out like to the bottom of this, like what is going on with Peter Parker, and like she should have followed him like everywhere he is to go. And like I think she should have turned into a reporter. I think that's where her life should have headed, because really like she probably should have realized that like acting wasn't exactly going to work out for her. So maybe she should have popped shots of Spider-Man instead and kind of followed Spider-Man around, but she didn't do that. It is what it is. So uh, Peter is to walk off from this funeral to mention that like with great power is great responsibility. That's my gift, my curse, and I am Spider-Man. So this ends with, of course, Peter Parker slinging all over the, of course, New York City, and he is to sling into frame or swing into picture, and that is to end this movie. So I am going to get out of here. Thank you if you watched this whole entire thing. I know this is a long video. I like to do these kind of long things because really I just get into a rhythm of things and then I can't stop. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.